Two companies process 86% of every credit card payment on Earth, even though they hold nobody's money and they have virtually no risk. Yet, their profit margin is around 50%, netting over $10 billion in profit every year. What are they actually charging for? To understand where the margin comes from, you have to understand who built the system and why. In September 1958, Bank of America mailed 65,000 working credit cards to the residents of Fresno, California. The card just arrived in your letterbox, preloaded with up to $500 in credit, ready to spend without anyone requesting one prior to the receival. They chose Fresno carefully, big enough to be a real test, small enough to contain the damage if it went wrong. Bank of America had 45% of the local market, which meant most people already had some relationship with them. And Fresno was geographically isolated. If the thing collapsed, it might not make the national news. And it almost did collapse. 22% of accounts went into the negatives in the first year. The bank lost somewhere between $9 and $20 million, depending on how you count the overhead. There was a wave of credit card fraud nobody had anticipated. Because it turns out, mailing tens of thousands of working financial instruments to strangers has consequences. But it didn't collapse. By 1961, the program was profitable. By 1966, it was nationwide. And then other banks noticed. That same year, a group of New York banks who hadn't been part of the Bank Americard program formed their own competing card. They called it Interbank. Eventually, it became MasterCard. By 1970, over 1,400 banks were issuing one of the two cards. At that point, Bank of America made a decision that shaped everything that followed. They gave up direct control of Bank Americard. The issuing banks formed a consortium, a membership corporation owned by the same banks that printed and distributed the cards. A man named D. Hawk became its first CEO and spent the next decade building it into a global network. In 1976, they renamed it Visa. The structure that came out of the reorganization is called the four-party system. When you tap your card, four parties are involved: you, your bank, the merchant, and the merchant's bank. Visa or MasterCard sits in the middle as the network, connecting all four and setting the rules. Now, the fee the merchant pays is called the interchange fee. Most of it goes to your issuing bank, not to Visa or MasterCard, to the bank that gives you the card. Visa and MasterCard collect a small assessment on top, a fraction of a percent. So the question of why their margins are 50% becomes a little more vague. What really is it for? The answer lies in how broken the system operates. The banks that made the cards also run the network. They set the fees, but they also set the rules. And the rules they wrote together are where this gets interesting. The first rule was called Honor All Cards. If you accepted Visa, you accepted every Visa card. No picking and choosing or refusing the cards with higher fees. You take the network, you take all of it. The second rule was about steering. Merchants who signed up were prohibited from telling customers to use a cheaper payment method. No sign on the counter asking people to pay cash, no discount for using debit instead of credit. The fee stays invisible because the contract made sure of it. Now come the margins this produced. Visa's net profit margin sits at around 51%. MasterCard's is around 46%. Banks average roughly 15 to 30%, and banks are considered one of the most profitable industries on Earth. Visa and MasterCard beat them by 20 to 30 percentage points while holding none of the same risks like loans or defaults. If you don't pay your credit card bill, that's your bank's problem. Visa already got paid. And whenever something threatened to change the system, they dealt with it. When Apple launched Apple Pay, Visa internally called it an existential threat to their debit business. Rather than compete, they made a deal. Apple would be allowed to run on Visa's debit network, and in exchange, Apple agreed not to develop payment functionality that would directly compete with Visa. Apple Pay became a Visa product wearing Apple's branding. The threat was neutralized by becoming a partner. Square was building a wallet product called Cash Drawer in 2016 that would let users move money without touching Visa's network at all. A Visa manager described the approach internally in writing, "We've got Square on a short leash, and our deal structure was meant to protect against disintermediation." Visa threatened to terminate its contract with Square's Cash App, which would have triggered higher fees and financial penalties. Square killed Cash Drawer. In 2023, Visa went further and won an agreement that Square would route 97% of its Cash App Pay transactions over Visa's rails specifically, rather than through the cheaper ACH alternative that was available to them. With PayPal, Visa used the same lever, the threat of punitive fees, to push PayPal into agreements that capped what PayPal could build on its own. These are allegations from the Department of Justice's 2024 antitrust lawsuit against Visa, which is still active. But the detail in the complaint is specific. Named companies, named products, named internal quotes, and a named year in which a product was killed. Beyond the individual deals, the DOJ's complaint states that Visa pays competitors hundreds of millions of dollars a year to blunt the risk they develop technology that could threaten Visa's position, essentially guarding their monopolistic-like position. But even without those deals, breaking into this market is close to impossible on its own. Merchants won't accept a card network that consumers don't carry. Consumers won't carry a card that merchants don't accept. To launch a competitor, you need both sides at the same time. Before you've processed a single transaction, you need to spend billions building infrastructure, win regulatory approval in dozens of countries, and somehow convince merchants and consumers to move simultaneously, against two incumbents that have been operating globally for 50 years. Over that same period, Visa and MasterCard made more than 50 acquisitions, averaging over $1 billion each, specifically to absorb anything that started to look promising. The market is closed because every serious attempt is either bought or neutralized. Consumers are particularly hard to incentivize to change because of another layer, the rewards layer. The bulk of the interchange goes to your issuing bank. The bank uses part of that money to fund cashback, points, airline miles. The more generous the rewards, the higher the interchange. A premium travel card like Chase Sapphire Reserve or an Amex Platinum carries interchange of over 2%. A basic debit card might be a fraction of that. Every time a customer pulls out the rewards card, the merchant pays more to fund the points that the customer is about to earn. The merchant still can't tell you. The contract won't let them. A Federal Reserve study found that the highest income households receive a net subsidy of $756 a year through rewards programs. The lowest income households pay a net transfer of $23 a year into the same system. $15 billion a year, moving upward, funded by a fee baked into the price of everything you buy. The person paying cash at the register pays the same price as the person earning miles. They get nothing back. They are subsidizing someone else's flight to Lisbon. The people who love their airline miles are some of the system's most reliable defenders. They just don't know that's what they're doing. So, who is actually carrying the cost? The first thing worth considering to find that answer is the scale of it. In 2025, U.S. merchants paid $198.25 billion in swipe fees, up from $187 billion the year before and 219% higher than when records started being tracked in 2009. According to the Nielsen report, that makes card fees the single highest operating cost for most retailers after labor. It's higher than rent and energy bills. That's how bad it is. For the average American family, it works out to costing roughly $1,200 a year, built into the price of groceries, petrol, coffee, everything you buy. Even the family paying cash at the checkout is still paying it. It is already calculated in the price before they walk through the door. Does that mean the model is doomed and there's no way to fix it? Luckily, no. There are ways to fix it. In 2015, the European Union capped interchange fees by law. Credit cards, 0.3%. Debit cards, 0.2%. The Commission projected savings of around 6 billion euros a year for merchants. It was the most aggressive regulatory intervention into payment fees anywhere in the Western world, and initially it worked. The interchange fees came down. But by 2022, the average total cost of card payments across the EU had almost doubled, from 0.27% to 0.44%, higher than it was before the regulation came into force. What happened is that Visa and MasterCard responded by raising a different set of fees called scheme fees. Scheme fees are charged by the card networks directly, on top of interchange, and they were not covered by the regulation. The cap closed one door, and both companies walked through another one. The acquirers and the payment processors sitting between the networks and the merchants had no legal obligation to pass any savings on to either, so they held the margin for themselves. The study documenting all of this was commissioned by the European Commission itself. 10 years of the most serious regulatory attempt in the world, and the total cost to merchants ended up higher than where it started. So if the market won't fix it and legislation gets routed around, what actually works? The attempts to fix this from inside the system are worth understanding. In September 2024, the U.S. Department of Justice filed an antitrust lawsuit against Visa specifically for its monopoly over debit card payments. The case is still active. Visa already failed to have it dismissed. And in both chambers of Congress, the Credit Card Competition Act has been reintroduced, which would require the largest banks to route card transactions over at least 2 competing networks, rather than defaulting to Visa or MasterCard every time. Estimates put the savings around $15 billion a year for merchants and consumers if it passed. As of 2026, it has not passed. Attempts to attach it to a cryptocurrency bill earlier this year were dropped. The reason to be skeptical lies in 2010. In 2010, Congress passed the Durbin Amendment, which required debit cards to carry at least 2 unaffiliated networks, so merchants had a choice of where to route transactions. It was the same idea as the Credit Card Competition Act, applied specifically to debit. And Visa's response, the thing the DOJ complaint is documenting 14 years later, was to spend the next decade systematically neutralizing it, striking deals with Apple, PayPal, and Square, locking in routing agreements, making sure that even when 2 networks existed on a card, only one was ever really available. The amendment is still law. The competition it was supposed to create, largely, is not. The places where an alternative to Visa and MasterCard actually took hold did not get there through litigation or legislation of any kind. China did not allow Visa or MasterCard to clear domestic payments. The People's Bank of China created a mandatory technological standard that foreign networks could not meet. UnionPay, built under the direct oversight of the central bank, is now the 2nd largest payment network on Earth by transaction value. India mandated that any business above a certain size had to accept RuPay, integrating it into a national financial inclusion program. By 2024, RuPay accounted for half of all new credit cards issued in the country. Neither of those happened because a better product won in an open market. They happened because the government decided the market is not going to fix it and acted accordingly. This is not a comfortable solution any consumer wants to hear, but it is the one that the evidence points to. So what are they actually charging for? Turns out, mostly for the fact that you have no choice, and any new choice that is offered will be fought against. That's what makes the business so criminal. Speaking of companies that quietly reshape entire economies around them, we did a video on what actually happens to a town when IKEA moves in. Links up here.